I'm excited to be with you. Morning where you are, evening where I am. It's Saturday evening. We're expecting quite a bit of snow tomorrow. So our church is actually not happening tomorrow. So I'm excited to be with you tonight here for me and in the morning for you. For those of you that met me when I was there a couple months ago, I look a little bit different. I grew out my beard, so I actually look all of the 39 years that I am. Got the gray here in the front, very prominent, so you can see how old exactly I am. So, those of you that haven't met me, my name is Will. I am a pastor here of a small church affiliated with Living Hope called Compass in Louisville, Kentucky, home of Kentucky Fried Chicken. I've been married to my wife, Becca, for 15 and a half years now. And we have three children. My son, Liam, is 8. My daughter, Hannah, just turned 6. And then our youngest, Isaac, is 2. And this morning, what I wanted to share with you, and I'm hoping to have the opportunity to share once a month or so with you for now, and we'll see how things do going forward. But the topic of my teaching this morning is called Change in the New Year. I want to begin with a story about a famous basketball player. There was a young man who grew up in North Carolina. He had an older brother who helped stoke his interest in sports, especially basketball and baseball. When he got to high school, this young man's main dream was to make the varsity basketball team. Now, his sophomore year, this young man tried out for varsity, and he was one of the last few young men to be cut from the team. He was, however, offered a spot on the junior varsity team, the next level down. Now, this was a crossroads in the life of this young man. He was, of course, devastated that he was not chosen for the varsity team. So he could do a couple things. He could choose to focus on a different sport. Maybe baseball would be a better sport for him. He could quit sports altogether and maybe he could work on something else. Later in life, he'd go on to be a great businessman. So maybe he could have done that sooner. Maybe he could have gone into business or thought about business. So, what did this young man do? Well, he didn't give up. He took the spot on the junior varsity team. He showed up early before school to practice. He worked diligently at the hoop outside his house. He received the coaching from his junior varsity coach, and he continued getting better at the sport of basketball. He dominated the competition in junior varsity, scoring 40 points a game on occasion. The following year, his junior year, not only did he make the varsity team, but he scored 35 points in his first game on the varsity team. Now, eventually, he'd be highly recruited to play college basketball. He would end up playing basketball in the NBA, and he played in the NBA for many years. And he would go on to arguably be the greatest basketball player to ever play the game. Many of you probably know his name. His name is Michael Jordan. Now, for those of us in America, we love these kinds of stories where someone starts out and maybe they're not as successful as they'd like, and then they become super successful. And as Americans in the United States, we call sometimes these stories like pull them up by their bootstraps kind of stories. And I'd love to say that this is one of those stories where he just worked really hard and he got better, and that's what made him successful. And that's part of the story. That's part of what made him successful. But I also left out some important details in Michael Jordan's life. During his sophomore year, Michael was 5'10", and he was considered skinny. So for those of you that remember how tall I was, he was basically my size sophomore year. I was going to say probably a couple pounds lighter than me currently. The next year, before he became a junior, he grew 6 inches and he worked hard in the weight room, giving him more prototypical basketball size. So, what's the moral of this story? The moral of the story is that positive change often requires 2 things. Positive change does require that we keep doing what we know to do. Michael Jordan kept working on his basketball game. He kept practicing. He took the coaching that his coaches gave to him. He did all the things he was supposed to do. He went to the weight room and he got stronger. So positive change does require that we keep doing what we know to do. We have to stay engaged in what we know is right. We have to stay committed. But positive change generally also requires support from the outside. We need friends to help support our life as we make positive changes. We need encouragement, or we need a growth spurt like Michael Jordan had, whether that's physically in his case, or in our case, oftentimes that growth spurt needs to come mentally or spiritually. And when we think about spiritual change, there are two parties involved, you and God. The new year is a time when many of us think about the past year and we make goals for this new year. It's a time to think more deeply about life and how we want to make changes to improve things in the new year. It's a time of hope for what could be. And yet we know the stereotypes around New Year's resolutions. The average New Year's resolutions last around a couple months. Well, today I want to offer you a New Year's resolution that I believe that you can accomplish and that will also meaningfully change your life for the better. This is the New Year's resolution I offer to you. Be transformed and not conformed. Those of you who know the Bible well will know that our text this morning is in Romans chapter 12. And if you want to turn there, I'll join you here in a minute. So the goal I'm offering to you is to be transformed and not conformed. And unlike your past fitness New Year's resolutions, which depended on your strength of will and maybe like a workout partner or someone keeping you on your game, on your best game, so to speak, your spiritual workout partner in this endeavor is God, ultimately faithful and always there to support you in just the right way. Like I said, our text this morning is in Romans chapter 12. I'll read the first two verses. These are our two verses for this morning. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, I would add, and sisters. This word is inclusive in the Greek. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. You may know this, but this section of Romans begins what is called the more practical side of Romans. Just like the book of Ephesians is split into a doctrinal part and a practical part. And in Ephesians, that distinction, that change is made right in the middle of the book. Ephesians 1 through 3 is the doctrinal side. Ephesians 4 through 6 is the practical part. Well, in Romans, the doctrinal part is the first 11 chapters, and the practical part begins in chapter 12. And as many have pointed out, the fact that Paul, obviously working with the Spirit of God, the fact that Paul would do this, that he would have parts of books, parts of his letters that are doctrinally focused, and then part of his books that are practically focused, the fact that Paul does that repeatedly underlines an important point. And that is that the gospel, the good news about Jesus, what he has done and what he will do when he returns, this good news is meant to be lived. This good news demands a practical response. To use another set of words to describe this, when we encounter Jesus, when we encounter the power and the grace of God, it should transform our lives. What we say, what we think, what we do. It should transform our whole lives. Now, in Ephesians, the focus is on walking unified, since one of the main themes of that letter is unity. Now, here in Romans, this specific entreaty fits the main theme of Romans. So he's asking us to be living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God. He's talking about spiritual worship. He's talking about not being conformed to the world. All these things make sense because one of the main themes of Romans is that deliverance from the power of sin and death makes available this new life, a new way to live, a new way to flourish, a new way to honor God in all that we do. Just as in Ephesians, we see Paul's pastoral heart here. He's appealing to them. One mind picture of this is picture a coach who puts his arm around a young person and explains to them gently what he wants them to do, what he wants that young athlete to do. Another mind picture of appealing or trying to come alongside someone is a mother gently calling a child aside to encourage the child to do something better. Oftentimes, I see my wife do this with my children. One of them is acting up or they're getting agitated about something. And my wife calls to them and says, "Come here." And she gets down on their level and she puts her arm around them and she encourages them to treat their siblings better or encourages them to treat their friends better or whatever the case might be. Now, behind Paul's words are what we call the mercies, plural, of God. So this reminds us that behind our actions of grace and love in this life, we also have the mercies of God. Now, what is Paul asking these believers to do? What is he appealing to them about? What does he want them to accomplish? Paul wants them to present their whole selves to God as a living sacrifice. The word bodies that he uses here in verse 1, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, that word bodies is a figure of speech that stands for our whole selves. Our whole selves are to be presented as a living sacrifice. Now, why would Paul use this figure of speech right here in Romans chapter 12, verse 1? I believe this figure of speech is used for a reason here, because it's supposed to bring our attention back to the sacrificial system that happened in the Old Testament under the law of Moses. For various reasons and at various times, ancient Israelites would bring animals to the tabernacle, or eventually when the temple was built, to the temple for a sacrifice. One of the first things that the priests would do in these situations to help with the sacrifice is kill the animal. That's one of the first things that they would do, is kill the animal. Then various parts of the animal would be discarded and other parts would be put on the altar and would be burned as a sacrifice to Yahweh. The body of the dead animal would be placed on the altar. And since the body was placed on the altar, Paul is drawing our attention to the fact that we put our bodies on the altar. We are to present our whole selves upon the altar. And I forget where I first heard this. It may have been a pastor here in the United States named Andrew Womack. But there's something unique about living sacrifices, sacrifices that are not dead. The problem with living sacrifices is they tend to crawl off the altar. When the heat starts on the altar, of course, if you're still alive, you don't want to be on the altar anymore. You want to get off that altar as quickly as possible. And the metaphor that we can understand about this is the heat of the world. It's persecution. As persecution comes, as you begin to envy the lives of the unbelievers around you, as you get tempted with this sin or with that sin, whatever the case might be, in all those circumstances, we are tempted to crawl off the altar. And so here we find what surrender to the purposes of God looks like. It looks like staying on the altar and presenting our whole lives to God, even when the circumstances of life are difficult. And I want to be careful here because the Christian life isn't all bad. It isn't all drudgery. It isn't all persecution and difficulty and hardship. Hopefully, none of us will be actual martyrs for our faith. Now, we all face less persecution and danger for our faith than the early apostles did. Many of us face less persecution and danger than some of our brothers and sisters do in more difficult parts of the world. And even if we did, there is joy and fulfillment and blessings and wonder, even in the midst of persecution. You could just ask the brothers and sisters around the world who are facing persecution. They'll tell you that they also still have joy. They still have wonder. They still have fulfillment. They still have blessings. That reminds me of a story that a pastor named Wayne Cordero, the pastor of New Hope Christian Fellowship in Honolulu, Hawaii, has told before. Pastor Wayne once went to China to train some underground house church leaders in secret. He met with 22 people who represented house church networks that could count membership in the 20 million people range. 22 people representing 20 million people in house church networks all over China. Now, he didn't have enough Bibles, and he noticed that one of the ladies handed her Bible to the person next to her. They turned to 2 Peter, and she was able to recite the whole chapter that he went to. At the break, the pastor asked her how she knew the passage so well. She told him that she had memorized much of the Bible in prison. People would smuggle in small pieces of paper with sections of the Bible written on them. The guards would confiscate them, but not before she would memorize those sections of the Bible. She said to him, "They can't steal what's in your heart." And at the end of 3 days of training, the people asked Pastor Cordero to pray that China could be more like the US so that they could meet more openly without fear of persecution. This is what Pastor Cordero said to them in response. I'm going to quote him. He said, "You guys rode a train for 13 hours to get here. In my country, if you've got to drive more than an hour, people don't come. You sat on a wooden floor for 3 days. In my country, if people have to sit more than 40 minutes, they leave. You sat not only here for 3 days on a hard wooden floor, but you did it without air conditioning. In my country, if it's not padded pews and air conditioning, people don't often come back. In my country, we have an average of 2 Bibles per family. We don't read any of them. You hardly have any Bibles, and you memorize them from pieces of paper. I will not pray that you become like us, but I will pray that we become like you." That's the end of the quote. We have brothers and sisters around the world facing extreme persecution. And in the midst of that, they have joy and peace and love and strength that does not come from them. All of that comes from God. Their whole lives are on the altar. Their whole lives are about spiritual worship, as it says here in Romans 12:1. I heard a sermon recently that one of the brothers in our church sent me about worship. The pastor talked about how the fundamentals for worship are laid out in an early occurrence of the word in the Bible, Genesis 22, where Abraham offers his son Isaac to God. This pastor said something interesting about worship. He said that the modern Christian movement has made worship about singing and music because singing and music doesn't ask anything more of us. We can feel good. We can do it maybe once a week in our meetings, and then it's over. He said that true worship is about putting everything on the altar and giving our whole lives to God, just as it says here in Romans chapter 12. So the question before us this morning is, are our whole lives on the altar? Or do we have a leg that's dangling off the altar? Do we have an arm that's wiggling around off the altar? Our whole lives should be presented to God as living sacrifices. Our whole lives should be viewed as worship. When you parent your kids in a way that leads them to follow Jesus, that is worship. When you forgive your enemy and you pray for them, that is worship. When you stop to encourage a stranger and share God's love and hope with them, that is worship. When you obey in the moment of temptation, that is worship. Worship is not just about dancing or lifting our hands. It's not just praising God through song, though that's a big aspect of it. And all of those things are biblical. Praising God with our song, praising God with our voice, praising God with instruments. All those things are very biblical. Those are aspects of worship for sure. Worship is not just about the gifts or manifestations of the Spirit, although these things are incredibly important for us both individually and in our communities. We have to begin to see worship bigger. Our whole lives should be lives of worship, living to praise the God who gives us this very life and breath that we have. David once prayed, "But who am I and what is my people that we should be able thus to offer willingly? For all things come from you, and of your own have we given you." He was talking about what we would call financial giving, but applies here to our whole lives as well. I would like to cite a commentator named Douglas Moo, a scholar. In one of his commentaries on Romans, he says this about this passage. He says, quote, "Regular meetings together of Christians for praise and mutual edification are appropriate and indeed commanded in Scripture. And what happens at these meetings is certainly worship. But such special times of corporate worship are only one aspect of the continual worship that each of us is to offer the Lord in the sacrifice of our bodies day by day." And that's the end of the quote. So the point that's being made here in Romans chapter 12 is that everything that we do is supposed to be about worship. We're to put our whole bodies, our whole lives on the altar. That is what we are supposed to do. Let's get to verse 2 now. I want to reread verse 2. "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." Now, in verse 2, the word world, do not be conformed to this world, is actually better translated as age. And if you think about the word age in the Bible, there's a current age that we live in right now. And that current age that we live in right now has systems in place that defy God. There are the course of this world. There is spiritual wickedness in high places, it says elsewhere in Paul's epistles. Now, these systems are part of this idea called the powers. And that's too big of a subject for me to talk about in detail today. But the powers are anything that can affect human behavior. It's all sorts of stuff can be defined as the powers in Scripture. But really, what I want you to think about in terms of powers today is evil forces. It's demons, and it's the systems that demons set up in this world to distract us, to keep us from doing the right things, and to keep people from God. So if you think about some of the worst systems that have ever been developed, things like racism and sexism and ageism, all these isms, these negative isms, these are all systems that were built by the devil and his demons. And these are what are called the powers in Scripture. And so right now we live in an age that has these powers at work. These powers are in the world around us. So the point that Paul's making here is that we are not supposed to do what the powers want us to do. We're supposed to do instead what God wants us to do. But here's the surprising part of this verse, and this might be new for you today. It was new for me when I discovered this some years back. The verb that is translated be transformed here in verse 2, Romans 12:2, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. That verb, be transformed, is not active voice, but it's passive voice. Now, I want to explain that really quickly here. Active voice is when I do something, like I throw the ball. If I say the sentence, I throw the ball, that's active. I am performing the action. A passive voice is when something else is doing the acting. So if I said the ball hit me, I'm the recipient of that action. So I am being hit by the ball. So this is the interesting part about this, is that this passive verb here means that we are not doing the action of the transformation. Here's another key point. The phrase renewal of your mind, it's not a verb phrase. Many of us have been taught that there is like this process called the renewed mind process. And look, I'm not saying that there isn't a renewed mind process. We can get this in scripture from 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5, how we cast down imaginations and we check everything against the knowledge of Christ. That is certainly an active process and something we can do. There is absolutely an active part in controlling our thinking, controlling our minds. But here in this specific verse, the renewal of the mind is not a verb, it's a noun phrase. And I know that this is all very nerdy, but I'm going to get to the point here right now. What this means is we do not do the action of being transformed by the renewal of our minds. That is not what we do. We receive this. We receive the result of what God does. And in other words, in this passage, we're not renewing our minds. That would be an active process whereby we do something. That's not what this is saying. This is saying that God transforms us by giving us something that he calls the renewed mind. It's a noun. Another commentary said this way: although God brings about the transformation, we must voluntarily place ourselves at his disposal so it can happen. He will not transform us against our will. The present tense suggests that this process is to continue throughout life. Transformation is not instantaneous. So if I can put verses 1 and 2 together here, this is how I would explain it. In the context here in Romans chapter 12, our job, what we're told to do in verse 1, our job is to keep putting ourselves on the altar. We keep presenting our bodies, our lives as living sacrifices. We keep resisting conformity to the world, this present evil age. We keep resisting the ideas, the plans, and the activities of this evil age. As we do that, as we keep our bodies on the altar, as we keep resisting the world and the evil influences of the world, what happens is God works within us to transform our thinking, to transform our speech, to transform the way that we live. So we have a job and God has a job. In other words, we put our lives on the altar and God transforms our lives by giving us a renewed mind. Instead of burning us up, he uses the fire on the altar to transform us into something new and pure and complete. That's what Romans 12, 1 and 2 is all about. As I've been reflecting on the new year and on this subject of change, one thing has stood out to me. There's an old adage that's attributed to a man named John Maxwell that says, change is inevitable, growth is optional. Change is inevitable, growth is optional. What this tells us is that no matter what happens through life, we are changing. The question is, are we moving forward or are we moving backwards? Or are we moving sideways? Are we moving a direction that's neither forwards nor backwards that well? And as we enter this new year, I encourage you to bring renewed intentionality and focus to your walk with God. We aren't just looking for change. Change is going to happen. We aren't just looking for change. We're looking for positive change that manifests as growth, that manifests as deliverance, that manifests as new horizons with God and with the community of faith around us. I want to close by considering the story from the beginning, the story of Michael Jordan. Now, let's imagine a scenario where Michael decides he doesn't want to play basketball his sophomore year. If he can't play varsity, he's not going to play at all. Now, he doesn't know it yet, but he's going to get that growth spurt no matter what. He's going to grow 6 inches no matter what. He doesn't know that as a sophomore, but he's going to get that growth spurt. Now, just 1 year of lost conditioning, lost skill, lost practice would have cost him a lot. Now, perhaps he still would have played in the NBA, but it is doubtful that he would have become the greatest basketball player of all time. He had to practice. He had to work. He had to be intentional to be his best. And he exemplified that throughout his career, not just his sophomore season. He continued working hard every single year of his life until the day that he retired. His transformation into an amazing basketball player took him years. Now, we can relate this to our spiritual lives. We will have moments. Sometimes we will have years of discouragement, of disappointment, and of pain. It doesn't do us any good to compare ourselves with others because we each fight our own battles. So my encouragement is for you to keep going, to keep crawling back onto the altar, to keep fighting for your faith, to keep fighting for your family, to keep fighting for your community of faith. Our lives aren't always easy or fun, but God is with us through it all. As we resist the impulses and the messages of this evil age, God transforms us. He shows us how to live in a way that reflects his nature of love, grace, and mercy. And I want to underline the importance of spiritual community in all of this. None of us lives in isolation. We live in a community of people who genuinely care about each other. There are things in your life that you've dealt with that you've shared with one another, that maybe has shown to each other that God has changed your minds and your hearts as you allowed him to. And maybe those experiences, sharing those experiences can help you. I've done that in my faith community here in Louisville. I've shared my life, how God has changed my mind and my heart as I've allowed him to do that with our church. And sometimes I think those things really help. And similarly, you face things that I haven't, and you can encourage each other by sharing those things that you've faced. We've all been shaped and molded by God in ways that are helpful to the people around us. So please, my plea is do not isolate yourself. Your community is built to serve one another, to love one another, to help one another. God can work with us directly through the power of the Spirit. Absolutely. He can always work within you as an individual, but he also often works within others in our lives to help us grow the way that he wants us to grow. And so that's my encouragement, is for you to keep your life on the altar, keep your whole body on the altar, watch as God works within your life as you dedicate your whole life in worship to him. He will do his part. He will be faithful to transform you, to show you a new way of living, to usher you into a greater way that he wants you to live. And the best way you're going to see that is by being in a committed community of faith like you have there in person there in the Philippines. So that's what I wanted to share with you this morning. God bless you all.